From 1946 to 1958, during the United States' occupation of Japan after their surrender at the end of World War II, the U.S. military tested nearly 24 nuclear weapons into Bikini Atoll, a coral reef near the Marshall Islands. The United States forcibly reoccupied the residents of the region in order to conduct these tests, an atrocity all on its own, considering the starvation-level conditions that refugees were left to deal with in the wake of their relocation. In 1954, one of these tests triggered an explosion twice as powerful as expected. The resulting fallout irradiated the Japanese fishing vessel Daigo Fukuryu Maru and its 23 crew, leading to the death of its chief radio man, weeks of radiation sickness for the rest, and mass outrage across Japan. At least one Japanese publication referred to the violence of the testing as, quote, the second atomic bombing of mankind. That same year, 1954, saw the release of Gojira, the first Godzilla movie. Let me start by saying that this is not a video about how Godzilla is a metaphor for the nuclear bomb. It is, sort of, but it's also a lot more complicated than that, in ways that are worth emphasizing. Regardless of its metaphorical power, though, Godzilla is a global franchise teddy bear at this point. He's the king of the men-in-suits monsters, the silly kaiju era of Japanese, and also American, movies about what if this insect or animal was big and could step on the skyscrapers. In Japan, Neon Genesis Evangelion director Hideaki Anno brought a blend of genuinely weird aesthetic and bureaucratic parody to the franchise with 2016's Shin Godzilla. In America, we most recently got the increasingly stupid but never smart franchise reboot that started in 2014 with a couple of moments of good atmosphere, a wasted Bryan Cranston performance, a mildly embarrassing Ken Watanabe performance, and a lot of dimly lit CGI. That 2014 reboot, particularly in early promotional materials, tried to evoke an apocalyptic, terrifying vision of the titular monster as an echo of the consequences of humanity's development of nuclear weapons. The earliest preview I saw used voiceover from the Oppenheimer tapes, for Christ's sake. 1954's Gojira, in stark contrast to its many successors, is elegiac. I'm not saying that the original Godzilla movie is not silly in moments. It definitely is, and it's ham-fisted too, with stilted dialogue and weird pacing. But it's also a stark movie about a tragedy, both past and ongoing, literal and metaphorical. It hides its monster costume goofiness in dramatic lighting and careful cinematography, but isn't afraid to use light and contrast to emphasize fear or hopelessness, usually in the faces of the many minuscule onlookers to the monster's inexorable destruction. There is, of course, a sequence where Godzilla steps all over Tokyo, but its dramatic core isn't the monster's roar or the breathless salvos of fighter jet bullets, but instead a beat where we see a cowering mother and child doomed in an alley between buildings about to be obliterated. The mother comforts her child by telling her they'll be with her father soon. This is 1954. The woman's husband died in World War II. This movie is scarred to its core by Japan's horrific, traumatic, lingering losses from the end of that era. After the Tokyo destruction sequence, the next significant set piece doesn't have Godzilla at all in it. Instead, it's a funereal sequence in which we watch a televised performance of a children's chorus of a, quote, prayer for peace, a ridiculously haunting piece of music laid over images of the convalescing, the suffering, the rubble. Post-war Japan was occupied by the American military until 1952, during which time the press was not allowed to distribute photography of the aftermath of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. A nation's suffering was stifled for nearly a decade. Consider then what Gojira's prayer for peace is doing taking up time in an ostensible monster movie goof. It's a totem, a recreation, and a reminder that violence is loss, but also that survival is omnipresent, that humanity rebuilds and reforms around what it has lost. This is a lot of heaviness to ask from a Godzilla movie, but remember, this film was made before Godzilla had any cultural cachet. In this movie, he's just a mindless monster, a force of nature birthed by man's meddling and powers beyond its control. He's pure metaphor, in other words, and the movie mines all the metaphorical power it can. The story isn't about Godzilla, but about what he does to Japan, and to Tokyo in particular. Now, this story works better in the broad strokes than it does in some of the details. As I said, the dialogue isn't good, and the character dynamics are all rough archetypes lacking nuance. Serizawa has this silly eye patch and barks all his lines. Emiko has no real personality except to scream at appropriate moments. Ogata is so unmemorable that I had to get his name off IMDb. Only the eternal Takashi Shimura elevates his character, bringing tremendous pathos to his haunted scientist, who understands better than anyone throughout the movie the horror that has been unleashed. The people are metaphor just as much as the monster. Reporters who report on atrocities even as they become victims, helpless but to observe and record. A society and military that defend and protect with a desperation that almost creates a personality, but one warped and over-defined by violence. An old man burdened by the weight of history. A youthful couple who can't fully grasp the meaning of the horror they witness. And a scarred war soldier who cannot escape war, who sacrifices himself and his perpetuation of violence for the sake of a future that will have to remember, but shouldn't have to suffer, a constant re-perpetuation of that violence. This movie exists in the immediate wake of the Bikini Atoll incident. Those tests are directly referenced in the film as the likely cause of Gojira's emergence, another atrocity against the Japanese people, spawning yet more suffering and violence. The movie ends on a blunt cry of slumping rage at the fact that they cannot rest, cannot put this past behind them. The fear of Godzilla returning, as the final lines of the movie formulate it, is actually a fear of humanity causing his return, or the return of something enough like him to be another apocalypse, another trauma for a wounded collective psyche, and the potential for another fracture in a cultural identity already teetering in existential crisis. On the one hand, I think it's a bit of a shame that this film's legacy is a long series of goofy popcorn flicks, because it saps our collective cultural memory of its power. Our here meaning American, or Western if you want. I don't think anyone in Japan is liable to forget this movie's particular legacy anytime soon. On the other hand, there was no way you'd make Gojira again in this form or context. It's an absolutely singular work that transcends form and genre, and it's probably a positive sign for the slow evolution of post-war Japanese cultural identity that they didn't make this movie again.